All right, so chapter 4, and A.W. Tozer, Pursuit of God. Before we begin, are there anything from previous chapters or even something about this chapter that just stands out as something that is either a burning question or something that you hated or something that you loved and you just just feel compelled to share that with the group? Stood up, you woke up at 3 this morning and you just were waiting for 10 o'clock to come so that you could get this off your chest and out in the open. If so, we want to entertain that. So everybody slept their normal hours, right? Nobody was up in the middle of the night. Yeah, so just not, you weren't dreaming about Tozer. All right, good enough. I'm fine with that. All right, so let's jump into chapter 4. Sure. Yeah. All right.
The language in this chapter was even more.
Yeah, it's a little technical than some of the others. And part of what he'll do is, and we're going to get into this chapter is to some degree, he sort of slides over into philosophical arguments for the existence of God. All right. So if you want to go back to your Philosophy 101 class that you had when you were a freshman or a sophomore in college, you sort of get this kind of idea. Well, this is what I wrote on the board. Eventually he gets to Anselm of Canterbury, who was the first guy to come up with what is called the ontological argument for God. And I know that's something y'all just were dying to get into. And ontological, O-N-T-O-L, O-N-T-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. And they're basically what that is, it's the state of being or existing as being before anything else. And so just hold on to that for just a second, because I'm going to lead up to it and then we're going to talk about it and then we're going to leave it, and that might make some of this stuff clearer. But yeah, this chapter is a little more technical than some of the others. And Anselm was 1075, 1078, somewhere in the 11th century. Canterbury, some of y'all been to Canterbury, but he was the archbishop there. There are two main arguments for the existence of God. One is obviously the ontological argument. The other one is the cosmological argument. And when he gets to chapter 6, he's going to talk about cosmological argument for God. And all that means that it's contingent, that creation is contingent upon something. Well, you keep working that back to eventually you got to get to where there's something that's not contingent upon anything else, which those people who subscribe to this theological, philosophical argument for God would say that behind it all, that is independent of everything else, is God. All right, so I mean, this is 4 is more so, 6 is easier, but he does get into the whole cosmological argument of God. And so just when we about midway through, we'll look at Anselm, and then if something doesn't work, then still a little unclear, just let me know and we'll kind of help flesh it out. Yeah, so the way chapter 4 begins is it's all right. Now keep in mind he's dealing with this interplay between knowledge of God, which he says, this is Tozer would say in the mid-20th century, this is in abundance. That there's all types of teaching in churches and just in society that to some degree highlights an understanding of who God is. Now, not who God is with faith, but just the idea of maybe like deity or some level of understanding He would say that in the mid-20th century, there's no lack of this going on in society. But what he's wanting, and this is the whole purpose of the book, is for people to go from their knowledge of God into some level of an experience with God, to know God. And that's the theme of every chapter. And so he begins chapter 4 with giving some level of breakdown of how someone might have knowledge about God. And one of them is, the vague notion that God might exist. Maybe it's a thought, maybe just general society, but just no real interaction with God, but just knowing that God might exist. An acquaintance. I mean, you know of a ton of people who exist and you don't have any experience with them. Same thing with God. He said, so that's sort of the entry level for people. Said the next group of people might know more about God from what God is not, sort of the negative argument. For those who read, if you were to read church history, at least the beginning part of church history, say the first 100 years of the church's history, and not read it from a perspective other than just a historian, not trying to bring in levels of faith or a bias towards Christianity, but just to read what took place, when it took place. One of the things that you would glean from that is an understanding of who God is from what God is not. Because the beginning part of the first century, the church was dealing with multiple levels of heresy. And so they began to come out with forms of creeds or pre-creeds trying to explain who God is from all the things that people were saying that eventually were deemed heretical. So there is some level of understanding of knowledge of something by knowing by what it's not. He said then there's another group of people, he calls it the highest ideal, and the idea that there is some level of understanding or knowledge of God by looking at the attributes of God, say goodness, beauty, things of that nature. Go back to what was your favorite book. This one might now take the place of your favorite book. C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain. Yeah, right, yes, So your dreams last night now just turned to a nightmare, so you're welcome. The idea, when C.S. Lewis is, I don't know if you remember, but the first couple of chapters of that book, he doesn't really get into the definition of pain yet. He's just trying to give some level of understanding who God is. And one of the arguments is the fact that there's goodness in the world inside of a world that has all types of badness or evil or whatever you want to term you want to put into it. At least that there is some level of goodness. You can trace that back to maybe there is a God who is good. Okay? So there is some that would sort of do the same thing here. They look out into the world, into the natural order, and they see beauty, they see goodness, and from that they conclude that there must be something behind it all that is good and beautiful as well. Now, it's not an interaction with the God or ever who God is. It's just how do we get to some levels of understanding about who God is? And Tozer would say these first three, this idea of a vague notion, the idea of having a knowledge of who God is by what God is not, and then the idea of at least some benevolent goodness behind it all, it is knowledge of God in some form or fashion, and you can have that and not have a personal experience. All right, so that's the beginning of chapter 4. Now he says for the Christian, here's a quote. All right, again, I don't know if it's on my page 46 or your page 46. While admitting his existence, they do not think of him as being knowable in the sense that we might know things or people. Acts 17, if you want a biblical reference, that's where Paul is in Athens and he's basically walking down the street and he sees all these different altars, and then there's one altar that's in the sort of the cul-de-sac that says this is the altar to the unknown God. Remember that story, Acts chapter 17? Paul would say this is what Tozer's getting at. Some level of understanding that behind it all there is something, even if we don't know who that is, and have never had any experience with that, we just being able to understand at least or have some level of knowledge that that can exist.
It's the last sentence on 37 into 38.
All right, the last sentence on page 37 and 38. So 46 was almost correct, which is another way of saying that it wasn't. So, so anyway, that was almost a good idea. One of those backhanded compliments, right? All right, so now Tozer also says that Christians who have a greater knowledge of God because of the creeds sort of distance themselves from these first three people or first three groups that have a knowledge of God but yet no personal experience. Christians have a knowledge of God through the creeds and have some level of interaction or some level of experience with God, but not the experience that Tozer is arguing for. So then we move from the idea of an acquaintance of someone to actually a knowledge that that person exists and some level of interaction, but you wouldn't consider yourself friends with that person. Does that make sense? That would probably be a good, maybe a good analogy. He says, but when we read the Scriptures, Scriptures inform us that God can be known, knowledge of God, and at the same time, God can be experienced. And ultimately, that's what Tozer wants for all people, particularly, and more specifically for all Christians. That's why he's writing this particular book. So the beginning of chapter 4, he's sort of outlining the different ways or by which someone might have a knowledge of God, but really want to get to just more than knowledge of God into some level of experience with God. So then the argument inside of chapter 4 transitions into, well, how do we then experience this God? And so Tozer spends a great deal, a number of pages, writing about how a person might experience something in the world. Obviously, your senses. You can taste it, you can smell it, you can hear it, you can touch it. You can do all these things with your senses, and from that experience, then you have a greater knowledge or even a greater experience. And he gives you some examples of that. Same with God. Tasting, oh taste and see that the Lord is good, Psalm 34. Smelling, Psalm 45. All thy garments smell of myrrh. Interesting. How many of you have ever smelled God? You smelled myrrh? Yeah, if you smell it one time, that's enough. I mean, it's really strong. And, there's actually, believe it or not, this is inside of a number of churches, primarily new church starts, they spend a great deal of time around sensory, experiential things when it comes to worship. And for instance, on Communion Sunday, they will bake the bread at the church. Yeah, exactly right. Y'all be hungry, right? So I mean, so the idea is, as soon as you walk into the church, what are you going to smell? Bread, baking, and so that's just another aspect of worship. I would find that very distractive as a preacher, because normally by the time we finish at noon, I'm so hungry that listen, if we can start getting out at 11:30, I can promise you that. Just start baking the bread. For those that are in part of the altar guild and the communion stewards, just start baking the bread on Communion Sunday. I guarantee you we're done in plenty of time. But the idea that worship, how do we have a more of an experiential aspect of worship, and so there are people who are sort of kind of dialing into that. But Tozer would say the same way that you experience something through your senses, something physical or what have you, he opts for that same level of interaction with God. Taste, smell, hear, John 10, my sheep hear my voice, can see God, Matthew chapter 5, blessed are the pure in heart, because what? They shall see God. So But now, when he spends maybe about a page or so talking about that. But then and you get this quote on my page 47, so I'm imagining that's your page 38. What can all this mean except that we have our heart's organ by means of which we can know God as certainly as we know material things through our familiar five senses. Is that page 38? 39. Thank you, Betty. All page numbers now go through Betty. So, so what Tozer does now is in the chapter is he says we have these physical faculties given for the purpose of experience. Likewise, we have a spiritual faculty to perceive God and His work. Now, what he's talking about there, obviously, is what we would call the heart, or at least something inside of us that can experience God. So then the question moves to what do we do to cultivate this spiritual faculty so that we can experience God? All right, so do you see the flow of the argument? He starts with, how do people at least have some level of knowledge with God? Well, vague notion, know God from what God is not. Then the idea of at least some level of behind it all. Maybe I see goodness and beauty. There's got to be something that's good and beautiful behind that. For Christians, it's a little more knowledge of God, but we want to eventually get down to where we're all experiencing God. Well, how do you experience God? There needs to be this spiritual, or we're given this spiritual faculty so that we can literally experience God in some form or fashion through the idea of our senses. So the rest of the chapter is about this idea of spiritual faculty. Okay, now for us, we would say that's in the heart, or at least some level that's inside of us that can experience God on some level or another. Now, what Tozer does, and somebody raise your hand when we get like 10:40-ish, all right? So, so anyway, so how do we cultivate this spiritual faculty? Now, he in chapter 6, just so that you know, in chapter 6, this is the majority of his argument. This idea of this spiritual faculty. He doesn't use that term. He only uses it in chapter 4, but it's the same concept. Now, what Tozer says is, he implies this, is that the moment someone becomes a Christian, and we talked about this last week, and even in the Sunday sermon, about justification, sanctification. Remember that? That little drawing, little thing we had, justification, and then sanctification. And this is instantaneous. It's something that God does the moment someone believes, all 100% God. At the same time, this begins this process of sanctification that's fluid. It's dynamic. It moves, and so it can move up and it can move down. And this is God and the person. This is just God alone. All this is how the New Testament describes salvation. Okay? Just uses these terms interchangeable. Sometimes it's talking about the justification side of salvation. Sometimes it's talking about the sanctification side of salvation. But if you look at the New Testament as a whole, this is what it means for someone to be saved. Both of these going on same time. So the idea is, Tozer would say that the moment this takes place, justification, what takes place inside of the heart or the person is that this spiritual faculty that has been lying dormant now comes alive. Put the paddles on, clear, boom, there it is. All right, that's the idea. And he says the reason why it's lying dormant is because of the effects of sin, whether it be small s, the sins that we commit, or big S, just the effects of sin in the world, that it has numbed a person, and this is all people, a person's ability to sense God. But the moment of faith takes place, the Holy Spirit breathes life into the person. That's Tozer's terms, also New Testament terms. And what happens then is this heart, or this spiritual faculty, becomes attuned even if it is to the smallest degree, becomes attuned or more attuned to the work of God in the world and in their own life. All right, you with me? Okay, good. So he then goes on to talk about how faith then, on this aspect of the salvation argument, faith then becomes more alive, it becomes living, it becomes dynamic, and it's something that we have to feed through our experiences with God. Now, when he's talking about this a little bit, one of the questions I asked of the text is, because he begins to kind of parse different Christians, which I'm a little uncomfortable with, because he talks about a descriptive measurement where he says that some Christians don't have faith enough or they have defective faith. Now, I would argue with him, you either have faith or you don't have faith. It's not an issue of where someone becomes a Christian and they get 2% of faith, and then, you know, at year 50 they're at 100% faith, and somewhere along the line, no, you have faith. It just needs to be exercised. It's always, if you say this, if I offend you, I need to go ahead and tell you I'm somewhat sorry, okay? Somewhat. I'm about 51% sorry, so it's actually a real sorry. How about that? Real apology. 49%, not so much. It's like when someone comes up to you and says, I have the gift of discernment. Let me tell you now what I discern. You can't argue against that. Is that right? I mean, you know, so if I come up and say, well, hey, you know, and I've got the gift of discernment, and I think you need to do this. If you don't do that, then that puts you in conflict with what I'm saying God is telling me that you need to do, right? So that's sort of like this defective faith argument where I want to go, come on, Tozer, you can do better than this. I mean, you know, there's no way to justify or prove someone has a spiritual faculty or someone doesn't. If the statement is true, the moment someone becomes a Christian, their spiritual faculty becomes more attuned to God, then just stay with that. Does that make sense? I hope, you know, that's a little. So I'm reading this, you know, a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going, all right, come on, Tozer, you can do better than this. I mean, you know, you're tracking, everything's good, and then we get to this idea where you say some have defective faith, some don't. No, you got faith or you don't. It's whether or not you exercise it. So anyways, anyway, just go back and watch this, delete the last minute of our conversation, and you'll probably be good. So then Tozer, he wants to talk about this spiritual faculty growing. And so he moves into terms that one term we use, one term not so much, and that is the idea of reckon and the idea of reality. Now, when he's in the chapter here, it's easy sort of to check out, because these are not terms that we use all the time. What Tozer says in my page 48, so I'm pretty sure Betty's, I'm going to guess that it's page 41. A spiritual kingdom lies all about us, enclosing us, embracing us, altogether within reach of our inner selves. Then he's talking about that spiritual faculty, waiting for us to recognize it. God Himself is here, waiting our response to His presence. The eternal world will come alive to us the moment we begin to reckon upon its reality. Is that right? Page 40. All right.
43.
Page 43. All right. So somewhere between page 40 and 48, you will find that quote. So your homework tonight is to go and find it. And if you want to highlight it, that's good too. So he starts with this idea of defining the reality. And this is where he gets into Rachel's question of what Anselm first came up with in around 1078. And it's called the ontological argument for the existence of God. And so one of the things that Anselm was keen on saying, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. All right, so that was part of his sermons all the time. And so the question is presented, which is greater? Something that is conceived in the mind only, a reality that you can think of or dream of or whatever it may be, or something that exists or reality that exists regardless if someone conceives of it. A or B? Okay, so which is greater? Can you hang on? Don't. Yeah. Which is the greater reality? A reality that you can think of, whether or not it exists outside of your mind or not, we don't know. Just the idea that you can think of it. That's A. The other reality is that it doesn't matter if you think of it or not. It exists in another dimension or whatever. It exists on its own. But maybe you think about it, maybe you don't. B or A? Who says A? Any A's? All right, who says B? Y'all didn't vote. Who says A? No, I'm just kidding. B is the answer. You don't know. And so what Anselm argues is that this is the greater reality. Whether or not somebody thinks about it or not, it doesn't matter. Now, a good example of this would be when we talk about love. There are some people, just because of past experiences in their life, it's very difficult for them to perceive any levels of love. Okay? That does exist, whether you know it or not. Someone can be very loving to them. They are not able to perceive it, so it really doesn't matter what the other person does, good, bad, or indifferent, it will not be perceived as loving. You with me? So this idea of there can be something that exists outside of the person's ability to perceive it, but it still exists. I can be loving to Ann. You're on. Ann is in seat 1 on my left, which always means she's the token person that she's always in the examples. So you get extra credit. Don't worry. But Ann can do everything within her ability to love me. But if I'm not able to perceive it, it doesn't negate the fact that the reality exists that she is loving me. Right? So the B argument is God exists in it's a reality. This is what Anselm would say. So whether or not someone has the ability to perceive it or not does not negate the fact that it still might exist. With me? All right. This one is dependent only on what the person can perceive, which is why B is greater than A.
Isn't it the same idea that God loves us, whether or not we choose to believe God exists, whether or not...
All right, so that would be a derivative of this. That if this reality exists, then if B is true and God exists, regardless if someone can perceive of it or not, then the things of God or the things that God either did, is doing right now, or will do in the future is not negated just because a person can't perceive of it or perceive that it exists. You with me? All right, so if you understand this, then you understand Anselm of Canterbury's ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, I know that I don't go home and read theological philosophy, but this is behind so many other people's theology that you love. John Calvin, John Wesley. This is, because it goes back to what's a priori. What's the idea that's behind it all? And for them, they start with that even if someone doesn't recognize, understand, or perceive, it doesn't negate the fact that there is something that nothing greater in reality. This is also, if you pass this, then you get an A on the midterm of basic Christian theology. So almost there. When we get to chapter 6, that's the final. So, all right. So any questions about this? Because we're going and so what Tozer is saying is that God exists in reality, regardless if someone can perceive it. But the fact that because of God existing in reality, And then God, through His grace and mercy, activates our spiritual faculty to not just know that there is a reality that God is, regardless if we perceive of it or not, but because of our spiritual faculty off life support, now living, then we get both, perceiving that God exists and the fact that God exists. So we have both A and B. And when we do that, we have the ability to experience this reality that exists regardless if someone perceives of it or not. I know that's heady, all right? Does that make sense? Yay or nay? Good? So we need a break now? So, I mean, not quite. So, because Tozer, so what Tozer says is that because God exists in reality, regardless if we perceive God or not, but the fact that God, our spiritual faculty now is attuned to that, then that opens the door for all types of experience with God, which then we go from just knowledge of God to now experience of God. We have both. Making 4 a little clearer? Chapter 4? All right. Actually, I want to stop here anyways and take a break because this is a good time to stop, and because if we start going, then we need to go for about another 15, 20 minutes. All right, so let's take a break for about 10 minutes or so. Okay, I hope that everybody got a copy of the prayer list. Yes, ma'am. Oh, really? Like in page numbers or? Interesting. Is it the same printing house? At the very end. Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. All right, let's go ahead and we'll come back to order. All right. Yeah, I have some up here. We need some more. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so for Tozer, so we got this idea of the reality of God, God's existence, which is independent of whether or not a person can perceive of that reality. But the moment conversion takes place, you have this spiritual faculty that is awakened and obviously in tune towards that reality. Tozer, the reality exists, talking about God, even without one's experience. But when one does experience it, it is much more real. The person can experience the world around him or her, taste, see, smell, hear. The same is done when one worships God. So that spiritual faculty that he talked about in the beginning of the chapter becomes alive and is active in worship, active in sensing God. He said. Then he moves into this whole concept of moves from reality to reckon. Something similar to like imagination, faith creates nothing, but reckons or acknowledges what is already there. So he makes a difference between the idea of just imagining, again, this perceiving. Remember, the A part is what you can perceive, and he says that what he's after is not just the imagination or visualization as much as it is actually experiencing God, and through this spiritual faculty that is lying dormant until the Holy Spirit moves in. Now he says, why do people, the last part of the chapter is where Tozer addresses the issue of why do we struggle with experiencing this God. And he sort of gives a couple of different answers. One is he says we're accustomed to what's physical and not something that would be metaphysical. At the same time, he says that sin, small s or big S, has clouded our vision. And maybe a good example of that would be Luke 24 in the Emmaus, the walk to Emmaus passage. Do y'all remember that one? So basically you have two disciples or two people. They're leaving Jerusalem. They're on their way to Emmaus. They have this experience and interaction with a third person. And when they first meet this third person, do they know who the person is? No. And they walk with him, they talk with him, they have all this theological debate and interaction with him. And even they don't recognize the person until actually the breaking of the bread. That's Luke 24. And so you have this idea of interaction with this person, but it's not until something that takes place that they're able then to really understand and know who was that was with them. And Tozer would argue that happens often in our life because of small s and big S inside the world. But he says the more we focus on God, the more the Spirit shapes our sight so that we have the ability to see who Christ is, or who God is in Christ, and what God does through Christ. So the more we participate with God, and I would then insert through disciplines, spiritual disciplines, the more that spiritual faculty becomes attuned to use Tozer's words, the reality of God and His existence. I think John 9 is the best example in the New Testament. All right? So look at the screen if you would. We're just going to kind of briefly go through John 9 quickly while we have some time, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the beginning of John 9, all right, so let me give you a little bit of context. John 7 and John 8 is Jesus. He's up. Oh, we don't have a map anymore, do we? Yeah. So might need to pull that up. He's in the northern part of Israel, Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, all that area. And he's up there, and it's about time for one of the major festivals in Jerusalem. In first century Judaism, worship in Jerusalem revolved around these 7 different, or a handful of different festivals outlined in the Old Testament. One of them is, if you got Jewish friends or brothers and sisters, they just finished one, the Festival of Booths. And you might have, if you drove out River Road, you might have saw the booth outside. If you're up in Atlanta by Emory, you see them all over the place. And you can see them on the road and what have you. And during that week-long festival, what's highlighted in John chapter 7 is John, the gospel writer, draws upon 2 major aspects of the Festival of Booths. One is the use of water. Every morning when they were in Jerusalem, the priest would dress up in full garb and would walk out of the city, had this big pitcher, go down to the river, draw up some water, and then would come back, and people are singing and they're bringing their fruits and they're waving them around, and every morning the first part of the morning worship is they would pour the water from that big altar on the bronze altar, and they would sing the Hallel Psalms. I think it's Psalm like 100, somewhere in that neighborhood from the book of Psalms. There's like 10 or 11 of them. And so they would do that every morning. And in the evening, they would light up the temple courts with all types of torches. And so the 2 major themes in the first century of what's going on at this particular festival is water and light. But when we get to the end of John chapter 7, and we go into John chapter 8, Jesus is making a comparison to what they're doing in worship, where he says, if anyone who thirsts, let him come to me. Right? So they've just been talking about water for about 8 days, and all of a sudden he looks around and he says, look, I'm the one that can give you, give you drink where you won't be thirsty again. When you get to chapter 8, he makes the comparison that he is the light of the world. All right? So you might remember those passages. When he moves from there in John's Gospel, we get to John chapter 9, where the whole issue is around this person who can't see being able to see Jesus. So you got to see a little bit of the play on words of what John, the Gospel writer, is doing. So when Jesus leaves the temple, still in the Jerusalem area, he and his disciples are walking down the road, and they see a guy, and what we know about the guy is that it's common knowledge that the guy has been blind from birth. That's exactly what the passage here. Blindness was very common in the ancient world in the Middle East, often because of the type of climate, the reflection of the sun on the wilderness type area, the desert type areas. But in this case, this is not somebody who became blind just through natural living. This guy, what we do know, and it's common knowledge because everybody knows this, that the man's blind from birth. Well, his disciples ask a question, what's the cause of the blindness? Right, who sinned? Was it his sin or was it his parents' sin? And Jesus really doesn't answer the question. And he just says, well, neither one of them. I mean, he does to some degree. But he redirects the argument to that, let's not talk about the past for this guy as much as we're going to talk about the future. So what Jesus does is he spits on the ground and he takes the spittle and with the dirt, he makes this mud, puts it on the guy's eyes, and then sends him off to the pool of Siloam to go and wash in the pool, and the guy becomes healed. So this is all in the yellow. That's just the background information. When we get to the pink part is when we get some level of interaction with the guy. You know, up until now, it's just been Jesus. The only interaction that we have with the guy is that when Jesus, he allowed Jesus to spit on the ground and put the mud on him, which would make him unclean. I mean, do you like people spitting on you? It was a big no-no in the Old Testament. I mean, if you came in contact with someone else's spittle, you were unclean. So, but he allows it to happen. And then Jesus says, go wash in the pool. And so the guy's obedient, and he goes and washes in the pool and becomes healed. In the pink session, and this is where we first want to kind of dial in and pay attention, we get some level of interaction with the man. So basically the neighbors, this is all the crowd's people, the neighbors are wondering if this is the same guy. And the answer is, yeah, it is. Maybe no. And then there's a little bit about, in verse 10, how did, what was the cause of all this? Now his response is, in verse 11, the man they called Jesus. So how much does the blind man know about Jesus? Not much. He's just what? He's a man. Just a guy that I met, spit on the ground, told me to go wash. I washed. I mean, I would have washed. Somebody spit on the ground, put that on me, I'd be wanting to wash fast. So he washes, and all of a sudden he's healed. And the guy doesn't know much at all about who Jesus is. But to use Tozer, that spiritual faculty now has been brought back to life. All right? Don't know much about it. Still have a lot to learn. But at least now he's moved from, he's moving into not just a knowledge, now into some level of experience, to use Tozer's language from chapter 4. All right, so what happens is the man, oh, by the way, this happened on the Sabbath, which as you also know, that's a big no-no as well. And so, Jesus is doing, it's a double negative. He spit on the ground, put it on a guy, and then now he's healing on the Sabbath, which he's in deep trouble with some of the religious leaders. And so the religious leaders, some of them that is, go to the man, and actually his parents too, and they put him on trial, little mini trial of what's going on. And so they call the parents in. The parents are fearful that they're going to kick him out of the community. So they sort of just throw the son on the bus. He's of age. Ask him. We're not involved with this. They bring the man before him. And this is the first trial. And we get in verse 17 where the Pharisees, again, are talking to the blind man who can now see what happened, who did this. He tells them who did it. And then the man gives now some level of a response about who Jesus is. And Jesus is what? Prophet. So you went from man to prophet, right? I guess where you can read it. And so, and then what happens after this? We get where they bring him back in, and they beat upon him, and they bring the parents back in, they beat upon him a little bit. Eventually, they kick the guy out, okay? And so we meet, so in verse 35 in the green, Jesus heard about the guy that's been thrown out. And so Jesus goes and pursues him and asked him the question, do you believe in the Son of Man? All right, Son of Man here, Son of Man is probably more in line with how we would describe the Christ or the Messiah. We don't really talk about Son of Man much, right? So when Jesus, at lunch, somebody comes up to you and asks you, who is Jesus? You're going to say Son of Man, right? Probably not. All right. The only time you use son of man language is probably if someone, hey, grandmother, what does this mean? Oh, that says son of man. That's about the only time we're going to use this. But son of man in the first century was used all the time. And son of man title has more to do with how we perceive today the idea of the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One. But it's a big title in that day. So he at least has some level of connection to who Jesus is now, not just a prophet, now Son of Man. And then when Jesus leaves this guy, verse 36, who is he? This is the blind man speaking right here. Who is he? The man asked. Tell me so that I might believe in him. 37, Jesus says, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. How does it end? The man said, Lord, I believed, and what? He worshiped him. So we eventually get to Lord and worship. So you see the progression that's taken place. Started with not much at all. That spiritual faculty, to use Tozer's language, not much is going on. All of a sudden the man meets Jesus, has some level of experience, not a lot, and Jesus is seeing nothing more than just a man. As progression takes place, the guy's reflecting upon it. Now what we're assuming is that the heart is coming more alive, to use Tozer's language. So there's more knowledge about who Jesus is from experience. Son of Man, Lord, worship, all this progression is taking place, but it started with nothing. It ends with worship. You see that in the text? All right, so that's chapter 4 for Tozer. People have a knowledge of God, just that deity exists. Well, what that might be, vague notion, maybe some understanding of what He's not or what God is not. Then maybe this idea that behind is some level of goodness, of beauty, because I look out in the natural world and I see goodness and beauty, so maybe I conclude that something had to be the origin of that. Inside the church you have the creed, so you're getting more information about who this God is, what this God does. So all types of knowledge, at least in some level, about God. But the issue is, we want this spiritual faculty to come alive. So we go from knowledge to experience. And once we experience this God, then that spiritual faculty becomes alive and becomes more attuned to what God is doing in the world. And so there's levels of growth that takes place inside of the person. All that's chapter 4. And I would argue that the best example of that, if you want a biblical example, would be chapter 9. Inside the life of this blind guy. So, what we don't have, and if Tozer was here and Jesus and the disciples were here, one of the questions we might want to ask of them, and maybe even if the blind guy was here, is give us your understanding of who God is before the chapter even starts. Now, we assume not much. But at least by the time the chapter ends, it's, Lord, I believe, and you're worthy of worship. So, chapter 4 in John 9. So what questions come out of this that might be something that is still unclear, or something that is just something that's just a wonder, a wondering? None? So you're still thinking about the bread being baked at the church, right? I get that, So, yeah. Well, we the first thing I wrote on the board was Anselm's ontological argument. All right. What was on the left? The left, this side? Oh, it's all right. So it starts with that which nothing greater can exist. So on the left was an idea in a person.
And the other one is about
Just
doesn't matter whether
Yeah, an idea in existence.
Does that have to be proved, or is that just, I mean, you just, I know you said B was the right answer.
All right, so let's go back to it. All right,
Understand what I'm trying to say?
maybe. All right, so
God is a reality.
yeah, so
And
B.
whether you perceive it or not, it's a fact, is up to, it still is a reality, whereas me as an individual perceive it or not.
Right.
I believe that. I just am saying, does A have to have proof before he?
All right, so A.
I don't know how to ask it. I already told Pam I don't know how to ask it. I wasn't going to. Guess what?
That's all right. No, it's all good. So, all right, now what Tozer would say is you want both in the end. This is independent of what anybody, this does not need anything for proof of existence.
Because it is.
It is what it is, regardless if someone understands, experience, or knows. This is something that is human-based, strictly in what the person can think of. All right?
And that's the idealist?
Yeah, so an idealist would be one. A deist would be one. Deists are people that would say that there is a God, but God is not knowable in any real sense other than just in concept alone. And the idea would be is how did we get the world that we're in? And the classic argument is God's like a watchmaker. He winds the watch up, the world, sets it off into motion, and it goes on and do something else. And so you see some level of the attributes of God inside of the world and inside creation. But the idea of what tasting, seeing, hearing, any level, can't have a relationship. It's not this, Deist understanding of God is not relational at all. Strictly 100% what we call transcendence. All right, so transcendent means that God is completely separate from creation. Immanence is the idea that God is a part of creation and is knowable. And so what Christians believe is that God is both transcendent and immanent at the same time. All right? It's almost like a paradox. Again, all right, so now you went from Basic Christian Theology 101 to Basic Christian Theology 101A. All right, so and so you see examples of that. Genesis 1 and 2 are the best example. Genesis 1, totally transcendent. God speaks, it exists. No interaction at all. I mean, really, that's it. I mean, God just doing it all, boom, there it is. Genesis 2, God creates humanity, male and female, and interacts with them. There are two creation stories. I don't know if you know that or not. Uh-oh. So I mean, but there is. Go back and read Genesis 1 and then read Genesis 2. Genesis 1, if you are an architect or an engineer, you love Genesis 1 because it's logical. This, then this, then this, then this, and it's growing as it goes. It's one very vague. By the time it gets to the day 6, very complex. Genesis 2 is if a family therapist wrote creation story, or given their interpretation of creation, it would show up in Genesis, like Genesis 2. God is walking, interacting, talking, communing with. It's not trying to answer the when. All right, so let me just kind of help you out on this. This might be a rabbit trail. If it is, hopefully this will answer it. If it's not, then just smile. We still have 10 more minutes. The Bible does not answer the when and the how. It does not. It just says whenever. And that's what in the beginning means. Well, when it was the appropriate time. Well, what time is that? That's like when my children would call and they'd say, well, Dad, what time do I have to be home? Well, just be home when I think you need to be home. Well, no, give me a time. Well, come home at the appropriate time. No. I want a time. Is that midnight? Is it 11? Is it 1? What, to 10? I mean, that's in the beginning. The Hebrew word means, well, at the appropriate time. This is what happened. So it doesn't answer the when, and it doesn't answer the how. It just says God speaks it. right? And then it becomes reality, okay? But it does answer the who and the why. I mean, it spends all of its time on who and why. Who? God. Why? Because He wanted to. Wanted to be, wanted to share of Himself. I'm not trying to get into the whole evolution, creation. You can make up your own minds on that. All right. I'm not trying to argue one way over the other. I mean, I've got what I think, what's important and how it works. I'm just telling you that just from reading the text, this is just what the text does. There are two creation stories, Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Neither one of them answer the when or the how. It just, there it is. And I think behind it all is God. So whether or not, however you want to answer the how, go right ahead. But I think the Bible spends, basically the whole theme of the Bible is the who and the why. So if that's a rabbit trail, forgive me. It only took 2 minutes. I mean,
But can you look at it as the immanent God is God as man and a relational?
yeah, God is knowable and experiential.
God as a deity.
Yeah, all right, so those, if you, now Jesus, right, so what we find in Jesus is more immanent because He's knowable. I mean, He's involved with creation, a part of. There are parts of Jesus, particularly John chapter 1, that we get pre-existent logos, the Word. Remember? So you read John 1 through John 1:14. What you have is the Word was in existence before the incarnation. Just the incarnation is the way that is experienced with creation, with people. So now we're at Basic Christian Theology 101B. These are good questions to ask. I mean, how do you? So when someone comes up to you and they talk about God, about being holy, H-O-L, holy other, separate. So we're talking about the transcendence of God being outside of time and space. God speaks, boom, there it is. So if that's all God is, then there's no way that God can be known or even experienced, because you have what is non-created over here, and you have what is created over here. And so there's no way that what's on this side can ever really dance on this side of the spectrum, because it's unknowable, right? Job. So Job wants his day in court, right? That's what all the book of Job is. From after chapter 2 or 3, it's all about, I want my day in court with the Creator. What happens when he has his day in court?
Where were you when I created?
That's exactly right. Where were you? And then you get like 3 chapters when all this happened. The bottom line is, you exist over here, I exist over here. So make sure you really want to know. I mean, before you can belly up at my table, be careful what you ask for, because God is transcendent, holy, separate, other than. Well, if that's all God was, then there's no way that anybody would ever be able to experience and know who God is, because how many of you are, playing around with John's stuff, he's going to come here and get me. How many of you are co-eternal? No, it's through Jesus. I mean, how many of you have existed before anything? Well, yeah, nobody. That's right. Yeah, good Methodist. Now we're going to sit on our hands. So none of us. So I mean, nobody has. I mean, no one has on their resume the ability to, if it's just about transcendence, the ability to say anything other than we're just receivers. So if that's all God is, then it is what it is. I mean, you can't do anything about it. But the fact that God moves also over here by will, not that someone pushes God to do it. God, out of His own will, becomes part of creation in Jesus Christ, he's knowable. I mean, here the only level of experience would be just through whatever basic revelation God gives. For instance, if you've ever said this to your children or grandchildren, you're on the transcendent side. It's because I said so. Now, what's behind that? You're not big enough to ask this question yet. There's not equality. Inequality. You're down here. I'm up here. My rules because I said so. But at some point, with children or grandchildren, you move over here and you invite them to be a part of the discussion, right? Hopefully you have. If not, it might be too late. But that's a different question. So hopefully you have. All right? This is why the incarnation is so important for our faith. God moves from not just transcendence, but immanence, knowable. The ability to interact with. So if you want to see what the face of a transcendent God looks like, you see it in Jesus Christ. And that's why the incarnation, it is one of the thing, if not the only thing, for Christianity. Because there are other religions that when you look at them, it's all, God is nothing more than immanence.
Is that Judaism then?
Judaism is more this side than that side. Yeah.
They're all transcendent and they don't have like a relational.
Yeah. There is levels of relationship with God through revelation, but not face of. If that makes sense. Let's see. Some Hinduism, Buddhism over here. God is known through creation only. All right. So the only one that has transcendence and immanence is Christianity. Maybe Islam, but Islam is more over here than here.
Shane,
Yes, ma'am.
would it help that A and B to think about the people who say perception is reality?
Sure.
I hear that a lot, and I would say, no, there's an objective reality.
Right.
How you perceive it is your interpretation.
That's right.
There is an objective reality apart from the perception.
That's right. So there.
It happened or it didn't happen. It is what it is.
Yeah, but that is true. But the goal is for what is real to be perceived. Right. So that's so that then you see both sides of it. 'Cause what happens when someone can't perceive it? They live as if it's not real. Okay? That's exactly right. So once it is perceived, then it's the best of both worlds. Which is why Tozer argues for experiencing God and not just in all faculties, so that what happens is you get the best of both. All right, we got any other questions? We still have a couple of minutes if interested. Yeah, so the question, hang on, Joanne, did that answer yours? Probably not, maybe. So we might come back. Reckon, so what, he defines this idea of reckon as on this side of that ontological argument, what someone perceives, all right? And like visualization or imagination, he says that for some people, this is where they're at. He says the goal, he says faith is not just imagination or visualization, but faith allows you to take what can be and actually realize that it already is. That's what he means by reckon. Bringing the two together, to what Mary Sue just said. I mean, the way he uses reckon with definition is not the way we use it today. Yeah, you reckon so. That's exactly right. Yeah, good one. All right, so Any other last thoughts? Anything unclear? All right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.